Conscient Podcast, Episode 169. Scientist, social innovator, systems mediator, and poet, Louise Adongo.
And wondering how we remind ourselves that we're all creative and we're all artists. Because I think that we need all parts of ourselves to be able to navigate this transition that we're in as a species and as a part of the world.
I first met Louise Adongo at the Transition Innovation Group. You can see episode 163 for more about them. We spoke on Monday, April 22nd, 2024, which is Earth Day. And Earth Day came up in our conversation as a day that should happen every day. Louise is a bold and grounded leader in systems change, policy, and evaluation, who is a founder of Cyprivian Strip and a co-steward with the Transition Bridges project. Louise's work brings care and intention to uncovering the roots of tangled problems, enabling shifts to greater resilience, sustainability, and impact. And I've had the pleasure of hearing Louise talk about it many times during these Transition Innovation Group meetings. And I noticed that there's most often an arts component, an arts through line in her work. For example,
There are artists in community, and creativity is really important in a context where you're trying to inspire imagination and do strengths-based and asset-based work in contexts that maybe do not naturally see and think of things that way. I've always just understood that creatives and artists have a way of drawing out of us more than what we even understand ourselves on a surface level. And so there wasn't ever a question in my mind when I came into this role and that we were going to do some, the concept of thriving communities. I don't know that there's no conceptualization of thriving that doesn't include imagery and visuals and poetry around thriving to inspire people.
Louise believes in co-creating more nimble, transparent, and creative institutional spaces. And she believes, and I agree, that this is key to the reinvention that we all need. And one of the things we discussed is slowing down. It comes up again and again in this podcast, and I really appreciate Louise's take on slowing down.
My perspective on what the slowing down means is that we really need to think more deeply before we take the actions, which is different than let's slow down and not take any actions at all. And so the system mediation is, it feeds, I guess, my action orientation, because there's context where it's willing to actually step in and say the hard thing to people that need to understand their readiness to hear the hard thing. So it's not waiting to say the hard thing until people are ready to hear it. It's almost saying the hard thing to determine how ready people are. And, when I think about culture and art and climate and defeatism, man, there's so many hard things that just need to start getting said. And I'm very hopeful and inspired that people have started saying it, right? Like electric vehicles that require us to mine precious metals in Africa using hands of tiny children is not a regenerative climate solution that we want to be part of, I hope.
We also discussed how to invite people to get further involved.
Less wanting to convert or convince people to respond to the reality of our state than figuring out how to create invitations for people to come to it for themselves.
Consider yourself invited. So, Louise, welcome to the Conscient Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here.
Now we haven't met in person, but we've been exchanging through the Transition Innovation Group, which there's a whole episode of our conversation about art and defeatism that you participated in. And I've been wanting to talk to you for a while because when I hear you speak about art, it's so much, you're so passionate about it, even though you're not directly involved in the arts. You are very much involved in the arts. So, and I've been reading, the work that you're doing with the Transition Bridging Project and some other things, which connect very much to the kind of work that I'm exploring this year around the end of the world as we know it and how we can plant seeds for the future. So let's begin just with a quick introduction of who you are, your background, some of your influences, so people can get to know you.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you talk about my passion for the arts. Whenever I'm asked to introduce myself, I kind of struggle with what version of myself should I introduce. Academically, I'm a scientist, actually, like a pure scientist. I have degrees in biology and chemistry and plant biochemistry. But outside of that, I'm kind of a everywhere, all over the place, all of the time person. And I think I would say I'm constantly curious about how things work or don't. I see patterns or schisms and patterns kind of everywhere. I can't help but see them. Um, and I'm very connected to nature. I think from childhood, I've always just loved being outside and hypersensitive person. I think there's a book called The Highly Sensitive Person. I'm very close to my emotions. I feel deeply. And I think that that has been probably how I've ended up doing the various types of work I've ended up doing and been involved in the types of things that I've been involved in over 2 decades, I would say. So I'm a researcher. I've done work in evaluation. I worked in public policy in the provincial government, and I spent formally in nonprofit 2.5 years, but I've been um, on boards and chaired boards and been in nonprofit organizations for, again, over 20 years. I guess that's how I would introduce me.
Mm-hmm. And what's your connection to the arts then? Has it always been a through line in your life kind of thing?
Yeah, I was thinking about that when you invited me to come and have this conversation, and I would say so. I I probably was always an artist. I just didn't go into artistry formally because generationally and I guess culturally, you're only allowed to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or some sort of even plant biochemistry is still not a doctor, lawyer, engineer. Um, but I was introduced to the arts through my father largely. My father would always expose us to music or creative writers. And then in school, growing up early on, I discovered poetry and literature. And my father loved reading, and so he would encourage our exploration more broadly. Yeah, so I would say that even though formally my father didn't encourage us as artists, he definitely supported any artistic endeavors that we have. We are all, me and my siblings have some sort of musical inclination. Um, and and we just it's very hard for us to silo our lives, I guess is what I would say. And so even though academically I would be exploring one thing, um, socially and through friendships and through relationships, I would be very connected to people who are in the arts. And my older siblings have done theater, and my older brother was in orchestral arrangements and things like that. So I've kind of just always been on the periphery, is I guess
Mm-hmm.
the best explanation.
Well, I'm interested in how you've used the arts in your work. I remember a presentation you gave at Transition Innovation Group about the inspiring communities. And so, can you tell us a story or two about how the arts have how you've used the arts and what the impact has been on communities?
Yeah, so I think I would say that because no matter what was going on, I was exploring or experiencing the arts. Um, I have always kind of understood that there is a magic is not the right word for it, but there is an inspiration and there is um, a way of navigating schisms and a rawness and creativity that really just transcends many of the rational spaces I've been in. And so as I stepped into this role that I just recently left with Inspiring Communities, in doing systems change in communities, I understood that there are artists in community and creativity is really important in a context where you're trying to inspire imagination and do strengths-based and asset-based work in contexts that maybe do not naturally see and think of things that way. Um, I've always just understood that creatives and artists have a way of drawing out of us more than what we even understand ourselves on a surface level. And so there wasn't ever a question in my mind when I came into this role and we were going to do some, you know, the concept of thriving communities. I don't know that there's no conceptualization of thriving that doesn't include imagery and visuals and poetry around thriving to inspire people, especially because the journey is nonlinear and complex, and sometimes you don't actually know the destination from the beginning. Just sounds like the world of creative and arts. So that's one of the ways in inspiring communities is we really just wanted to build stronger relationships with artists to see, are you thinking about these things? Are you already here? And we're just catching up to you. And then very specifically, two or three projects that I can think of where we intentionally and deliberately worked with artists to build programming around individual and communal healing and discovery of narratives as a change maker, or what making change looks like for people. Um, it, 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 it's a transformational journey that being accompanied on that journey by artists is very empowering and supportive, and actually links to what I'm involved in now as a transition bridges project steward. People keep when we talk about our work say, well, we're not in a place of transitions, we're in a place of transformation. But I really feel strongly that you can't actually get to the transformation if you don't understand what needs to be transformed. And so this transition of coming to an acceptance or a grief or a understanding your emotions around what is or isn't working is the beginning of the seeds of the transformation.
That's been my experience as I go through grieving, echo grieving, and other, I guess, emotions and states that you really need to come to terms with reality, but also transcend it through the body mind, the all of our abilities, not just our rational brain, which sometimes is in the way, right? Well, I'm interested in this notion of systemic mediation, right? Because you use that term in the Transition Bridge project, and it sounds like art to me. That's what artists do. They're
That's it.
mediating,
That's
right?
awesome. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a different definition of it on our website, transitionbridgesproject.net, I think is what it is. And hopefully we can share that with the show notes.
Yeah.
But so for me, when I think about it, um, and we talk about this pretty regularly as the group of co-stewards, there's kind of this external reality and conversation, and then there's the internal reality and conversation, and it's kind of like drawing from what we just said around transitions versus transformations. Um, and how I came to it was with after doing some reflection on the Berkana loop as well as the panarchy loop. I thought about in my own life that I could be in different parts of each of those loops at the same time. And that's what makes it hard. Like I'm at the same time as a person inside reckoning with various systems and various constructs that I'm living in, hospicing or testing out innovations or stewarding space for something new to emerge, or really fighting with the reality that something does need to end. And similarly with the panicky loop, I'm in creative and destruction in various aspects of my life or with various relationships that I have. Um, and so the mediation, certainly in the inner side, is how do you mediate those realities and come to kind of a groundedness and a directional alignment in the direction of the transformation. It's not easy. It's not, there's no silver bullets. I'll probably have a different answer if you ask me every single day consecutively for a week. But that's the space of mediation. And so the inner work of it is really important, also in systems, because what's going on internally is what's going on around us. And so
Mm-hmm.
from a systems context, when you add the multiplicity of actors and multi-systems and positionality within systems, but meanwhile, there's a purported desire to work towards a certain objective. How do you hold all that? And how do you increase the likelihood of success of reaching that? By mediating the relationships and the interactions and the dynamics that need to be mediated to get there.
Yeah.
And up until I came across this group and this term, which is why I joined them, I hadn't really heard so people who know me well are not going to ever accuse me of being passive and like taking my time with action. Like I have an action orientation, almost an impatience for it. Um, and yet there's, like Bayo Akomolafe says, the times are urgent, let us slow down. And and I struggle with that because I I sort of understand what slowing down means, and then I understand that the type of slowing down that I will see is not the type of slowing down that I think slowing down means. It is the not taking the actions that could be taken with the perception that that is what the slowing down means. When I really, if I put my perspective on what the slowing down means, is that we really need to think more deeply before we take the actions, which is different than let's slow down and not take any actions at all. And so the system mediation is it feeds, I guess, my action orientation, because there's context where it's willing to actually step in and say the hard thing to people that need to understand their readiness to hear the hard thing. So it's not waiting to say the hard thing until people are ready to hear it. It's almost saying the hard thing to determine how ready people are. And when I think about culture and art and climate and defeatism, man, there's so many hard things that just need to start getting said. And I'm very hopeful and inspired that people have started saying, right? Like electric vehicles that require us to mine precious metals in Africa using hands of tiny children is not a regenerative climate solution that we want to be part of, I hope. Um, I don't know that I would have heard such hard things being said in such a mainstream way.
It's interesting that you used that bio quote because one of my previous guests said exactly the same thing, and I was editing his episode this morning. And by the way, it's April 22nd, Earth Day, and you're talking about difficult conversations. Every day needs to be Earth Day, and it's a bit of a cliche, but I'm glad at least there's one day when people slow down a little bit, raise their awareness wherever they are in the world about the beauty and what's being lost, and to deal with their own anxieties, which is really hard to do, right? Because it's so overwhelming, and a lot of my colleagues in the arts feel disempowered, and yet they're very powerful beings in society. Talking about mediation, talking about culture, talking about art. So I'm interested in the dialogue that you talk about, because we need to go beyond awareness. Like I'm aware, but I'm scared, right? I'm aware and I'm scared, and I'm engaging And I might be wrong. I might say stupid things. I might, fail. But that it really, really opens up when you accept where we're at, as opposed to either denying it or fighting it with all your might and exhausting yourself. You know all about that because you work with communities, you work with all kinds of cultural workers who are trying to engage in systemic change, and we need to support each other and be sort of have solidarity in this journey of renewal and all that kind of thing. Maybe more personally, when you spoke at the art and how can art help defeat defeatism session, you talked about poetry in your life, and I'm interested in how that because poetry is so powerful, right? I was reading there was a Emergence magazine was had a episode about koans, which is type of Zen teaching, and there's just a few words I was listening to, and my world was transformed. How can words do that? Of course, it's the concepts behind them, but talk to me about poetry in your life.
So I was introduced to poetry two different ways. One is I'm going to completely mess it up, so I apologize to all the Kenyans. But so we have to learn English and Swahili in school system, and we would have to learn to recite these poems in Swahili. And there's something about multilingualism and needing to understand what words mean that, like, even to this day, because I have many other languages, there's words that you just have to leave them in the language they're in. They lose so much as you try to explain what they mean in English. They almost have an embodied power in them. And so we would recite these poems. And as I started to get older and pay attention to the words of what the poems were saying and kind of the metaphor of them, they became more powerful to me and they settled to me. And then I started, I think probably through puberty onwards, just as an outlet for myself in my journal, I would write poetry. And at first it was just like a release. And then when I would share my poems with some people, they would say, your poems are like, it's like a mirror. It's like the most raw, naked way of knowing what's going on for you inside. And I thought that was interesting. It's almost like a portal that cuts through all the veneer and all the ways of needing to shape shift and code switch to fit in. Poetry kind of the vulnerability um, is a portal to kind of what is possible. Um, if if I'm not in denialism or defeatism, if I think about it. And then the other way that I will talk about poetry, and I've never told her this. So Sue Goyette was a poet laureate, Halifax poet laureate, just an amazing author and poet and mentor to many. And me and her were on a board together, and it was a really challenging experience. But every time we would come to there would just be a really not even fractious conversation, but some of those conversations that you just like everybody is feeling it in their bodies of how are we going to navigate this. And Sue would say like three lines that would abstract us a little bit from the situation. Like she would be like, it's like as an example, she never said this, but she would be like, it's like a daisy, and you pull off each petal and you consider them separately, and then it stops being a daisy when you do that. So let's not do that. Let's just look at the daisy of the day, and it would just like cut through all the fog. And that's part of why I always kind of want to remember to bring the arts into things, whether it is dance or theater or music or a sculpture or a portrait or something abstract. Is this like reminding us to see the whole daisy, but also just cutting through the fog of all the ways we've told ourselves we can't do things? Almost a energy exchange of artists creating out of themselves. And therefore, the thing that gets created is it's almost its own sentience. I don't know how to put it. There was another, I participated in We Will Dance with Mountains, which, I recommend to anyone if it ever is made massively available, which was a course that Bio and some team members hosted. And there was a woman there that I'm going to forget her name now, but I'll look it up for you. And she encouraged us to, with every object that we interact with, even daily objects, to kind of, so I've heard this from Mathura in Dismantling the Master's Tools around considering the lineage of things. This woman, where she took it to like the nth degree for me, is she said, you need to consider the lineage of everything, even material things, even objects, even this China mug. What is the journey of this mug? What is whose hands in which factory formed it? The designer of the mug, the sand that got mixed in with. It was such a powerful way to think about life and the things around me. Um, and I was like, of course, it was an artist or somebody, with an artistic posturing that again cut through that it's not enough to care about throwaway fabrics because of how much waste they're creating in the world. It's like when you can't separate the fabric from its maker, from its weaver, from the grower of the cotton, or from the manufacturer of the poly plastics that created it, it really shifts our unwillingness to see and how unconscious we are about the world and how unconscious we are about our personal impact on the world and the systems that we've opted into in the world. I'll pull up Indy Johar now, who's also, we both know from TIG, is, every time he says it, I can't unsee it when he's like, our everything in our lives doesn't actually cost what we think it costs. It costs more. And Indy, if you listen to this, get some artists to help you visualize what you're saying so that it will be impactful to people. So you're absolutely correct, but it doesn't settle in our body as it would in an art exhibit of like this t-shirt. I can almost see it in a gallery, a t-shirt with like strings attached to it with right and the counter that like just keeps going ka-ching, 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 right?
Oh, well, it's so interesting that you raise Indy Johar because he's works with the Dark Matters Project in Europe and many other things. But I first met him in 2020. What year was it? It was the year of COVID, 2020. Stephen Huddard at McConnell Foundation invited some of us to Waterloo for a gathering, and he was hoping to do a series of gatherings, but then COVID happened. But that's where I met Indy, and when I was speaking with him, he said to me, "Oh, you work at Canada Council for the Arts. That's a noble institution. You got to change the institution. You have to use the institution." And I thought he was being so visionary, and saying you have to you totally change the institution so that it can become an agent of change. And I've always appreciated his vision, and he's very grounded, but he also says things. And what he said at the Art and Defeatism was that art was being co-opted, and that we need to get it back as a normal thing, as something that is part of our lives and not
And
commodified and all
I
that.
I feel like we've instrumentalized and trivialized art and actually lost its capacity to expand our thesis of how we
So there's
imagine
so many
ourselves and the world
interesting
around
connections,
us.
Louise, that have come through this social innovation group, which I was invited in, and other people come into. And there we are talking to each other and being vulnerable. Now, there's sometimes people cry at these meetings because they're so um, much in a feeling situation, in a situation of trust. And so I think that's what we need is conversations everywhere about the difficult issues, but also the joys of life that unfortunately are escaping us, but we can still pull back and slow down. And I don't think I know what bio means exactly by slow down, but I am thinking about it.
Yes, I can. I would just say yes. Um, One of the things I've been thinking about um, is fences and fence sitting and undecidedness
Mm.
and a and a numbing. And I just I many times I've heard this phrase. I can't really think about that. I have to take my kids to soccer, or those aren't really my problems. And because I don't I can't do that. I've been curious about that. I've been curious about, is that privilege that people get to do that? Is that a coping mechanism? Because and the reason I say coping mechanism is, as animals ourselves, as sentient beings, I find it very difficult to believe that we don't, even in our reptilian brain, know that something is very wrong with the balance on this planet that gives us everything we need to survive. I find that difficult to believe that in our quiet moments by ourselves, every single person with a heartbeat on earth is not feeling discordant, and the discordance is because of the fact that today is Earth Day. So I think part of where I've arrived at, which is why system mediation appeals to me, is and the transition innovation group and arts and culture and defeatism is less wanting to convert or convince people to respond to the reality of our state than figuring out how to create invitations for people to come to it for themselves. Like there's a reason, yeah. I I I'm curious about how people um, choose not to be fence sitting, because especially if fence sitting is seen as a neutral stance, the reality that there is actually no neutrality here. We're either actively working towards, again, Indy calls it our mutually assured thriving, or we're not, which means we have mutually assured destruction. And 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 so that's, selfishly, I guess that's part of why I keep coming to the arts and music and dance and ways to ease my own discomfort and discordance with that reality, is that we've been past midnight for so long. I don't even know. Every time I used to cry every time I would hear about whales beaching themselves and big mammals from the sea, and now I'm to the point where, like, almost every week they're talking about some ice shelf that's melting, and I'm not numb to it, because I definitely am like, oh, this is a big deal, this is really happening. And I'm navigating my sadness that not more of us are upset about that.
Yeah, all of that I agree. Yes. How about that? Yes, Louise. And we could go on for a long time. But we have a lot of themes come back. I had a conversation with Kamea Shane, who runs the Green Dreamer podcast, and we did a course called Alchemize, where we did a lot of body experiences and storytelling and visualization, and so that, for instance, the melting ice caps, it's perfectly normal to be sad about it, but then you might visualize them coming back, or what comes from a healthier world, partially for our own health, but also just to have that image in our mind and to share it, to share the story, to share this feeling. And whether you call it art or culture or personal expression, it doesn't matter that much. We've professionalized art, and there are a lot of good things that come from that, but it also sometimes restricts who can express themselves, right? who's listened to, and that's also a whole other topic is, the equity
Yeah.
of listening. And but it's just interesting to have open-ended conversations and then to feel the words and the emotions and let them sit and then see where our natural energies are and where our natural blockages are. Where do we not want to go? It was a conversation we had a while ago with Hildegard Westerkamp, who's a composer in Vancouver, and she said, "What are we not listening to,
Mm.
and why? Who are we not listening to? What are we not listening to?" And that's an important question. It's
Yeah.
relatively easy to listen to beautiful things and get inspired, hey, great. But, what are we not listening to, and how can we get there, and what kind of space can we create?
The most interesting part to me is to discover what we're not listening to and why we're not doing that.
You reminded me, I also asked the question, what are we pretending not to know?
Mhm.
And it reminded me, coming back to what you're talking about, arts and defeatism, when, when I said, will we recognize this, what the radical new way of being, and it's almost like, does it matter? Like if I don't recognize it, do I need to recognize it, or is it enough that it will be recognized somewhere by someone? Yeah, is also just a question that I'm having around centering even of myself. If I remember, it's because we're like, I like what you're saying about the being grieving the ice shells, but then also visualizing that they could grow back. And then it for me also takes facing this, but it will not be the same. But what will come will not be it coming back. It will be ice shelf being restored. Um, I think it was somebody else in that session that said, I work in climate work and I have to accept that the world I grew up in, even as we work to restore and save and protect, we are actually all working towards a newer world. We
Mhm.
cannot go backwards. That was a pretty powerful moment, even for me. I was like, oh my gosh, this person's right, right? Everything is shifting. The conversations around what peace is and what peace building looks like is shifting. There's not, there's, I don't know if there's any system or institution that is not kind of tectonically shifting right now. And so I'm just really agreeing with you and 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 wondering how we remind ourselves that we're all creative and we're all artists. Um, because I think that we need all parts of ourselves to be able to navigate this transition that we're in as a species and as a part of the world.
Well, we could end there, and we sort of will, but because thank you so much for that. I think that's a lot to think about and um, and then come back to, right? We can talk again in a year and see how things have evolved. I'm starting to do second and maybe eventually third conversations because it's an
Yeah.
ongoing, we change, right? And sometimes
Yeah.
we realize that there's awareness of something new that's come up that's worth sharing because we can learn from each other. Just to end, I usually ask my guests if there's a book or a film or something that you've experienced recently that you'd like to share. You've already made some notes, and I'll put them in the episode notes. But is there
Yeah.
anything else is there something that you'd like to recommend that people read or
Yes.
consult?
Yes. I just finished reading Soil by Camille Dungy. It is phenomenal. Um, she is a poet and a writer and kind of a art historian. And she writes about her own garden and she writes about gardens as a metaphor and she explores climate and how climate justice is also social justice. I watched The Creator and I would recommend it to people. It was very, I didn't want to watch it for the longest time just because of military themes and AI themes and global majority versus the United States themes. But it actually it's very, if you're willing to go on the journey of, gee, what does this connect to and what's actually going on in real life and what does this say to us about ourselves, I would highly recommend watching it. um hmm, I would, so this is not a book or a movie or anything. I would recommend that people go outside and spend time outside.
I'm going to do that right now. It's a beautiful day here in Ottawa, and you're in Halifax, right, I believe, today.
Yeah. While we
Um,
still can,
well, we
while
still
our
can.
air is still breathable, let's all go outside.
Yeah, and do some, especially Earth Day, but just and do something, and then have little rituals of gratitude that can be as simple as touching the earth and taking a moment. There's all kinds of ways to connect, reconnect, and
Yes.
connect. Thank you so much, Louise. This has been a lot of fun. We shall talk again. You've been a
Thank
wonderful
you.
conversationalist. I appreciate it.